Sarah Jenkins' morning began with a series of unfortunate events that would ultimately lead to a pivotal moment in both her life and the life of Judge Michael Patterson. At 6:45 a.m., her phone erupted with urgent messages from the hospital board. The Children's Wing Project, her passion for the past 2 years, was suddenly in jeopardy. Emergency meeting called. Major donor threatening to pull out. Need your signature and presentation by 9 a.m., read the text from her assistant. Sarah had planned her morning meticulously. Workout, shower, court appearance for a minor traffic violation at 8 a.m., then the regular board meeting at 10 a.m. Now, everything was chaos. She rushed through her morning routine, grabbing the first comfortable clothes she could find. A black Nike hoodie, designer sneakers, and yoga pants. Her natural hair, usually styled impeccably for board meetings, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. "I'll change at the office," she muttered, gathering her documents. In her rush, she almost forgot the thumb drive containing the Children's Wing presentation, the culmination of countless hours of work and $50 million in pledged donations. The traffic was unexpectedly heavy that morning. Sarah checked her watch repeatedly, anxiety building as she navigated through the congested streets of downtown. She needed to make it to court and then to the hospital board meeting. Lives literally depended on this project moving forward. The new wing would serve thousands of underprivileged children annually. Meanwhile, Judge Michael Patterson arrived at the courthouse as he had for the past 15 years. His morning routine was unchanging. Coffee from the corner shop, newspaper tucked under his arm, briefcase containing the day's cases. His clerk greeted him with the usual respectful nod. "Light morning, Your Honor. Only 12 cases, mostly traffic violations." Patterson nodded, scanning the docket. After 15 years on the bench, he prided himself on running an efficient courtroom. He had seen it all. Every excuse, every story, every attempt to avoid responsibility. He'd developed what he considered a finely tuned sense of character assessment. Sarah arrived at the courthouse with just minutes to spare, parking her Mercedes in the first available spot. She grabbed her bag, not bothering with her usual portfolio of credentials. It was just a simple traffic ticket. She'd explained the situation, pay the fine, and rush to save her project. The courthouse security guard gave her a suspicious look as she hurried through the metal detector. Sarah was used to these looks. They didn't stop even after decades of success, multiple degrees, and her position as one of the city's most influential healthcare advocates. Inside the courtroom, Judge Patterson observed the gathering defendants. His eyes lingered on Sarah, noting her casual attire with disapproval. In his experience, respect for the court began with appropriate dress. The hoodie and sneakers struck him as particularly disrespectful. Docket number 47. Sarah Jenkins, speeding violation. The clerk announced. Sarah stepped forward, already reaching for her phone, where she'd stored photos of the emergency board meeting notifications. "Your Honor, I can explain." Judge Patterson's gavel tapped sharply. "Ms. Jenkins, this is a court of law, not a casual conversation. Put your phone away." The judge's tone was one Sarah knew well, the voice of authority making assumptions. She'd heard it in countless boardrooms and meetings before proving herself. But today, she didn't have time for the usual dance of defying expectations. The children's wing couldn't wait. Little did either of them know, this seemingly routine traffic court appearance would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge their perspectives and change both their lives. In just a few days, Judge Patterson would find himself confronting his own biases in a way he never expected, and Sarah would turn an all-too-familiar experience of prejudgment into an opportunity for systemic change. The courtroom fell into an expectant hush as Sarah stood before Judge Patterson. Through the tall windows, morning sunlight cast long shadows across the polished floor, highlighting the stark contrast between her casual attire and the formal atmosphere of courtroom 3B. "Your Honor, I understand the gravity of my violation," Sarah began, her Harvard-trained legal mind automatically shifting into professional mode. "I was recorded driving 48 in a 35 zone. However, I'd like to provide context for. Ms. Jenkins, Judge Patterson interrupted, peering over his wire-rimmed glasses. The speed limit isn't a suggestion. It's not conditional on whether you're running late for work or a social engagement. Sarah's hand instinctively touched her cell phone in her hoodie pocket, where urgent messages continued to vibrate. The board meeting was starting without her, and millions in funding hung in the balance. She took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. With all due respect, Your Honor, this morning I was responding to an emergency regarding a pediatric healthcare facility that serves. Ms. Jenkins, the judge's voice carried a sharp edge now. I've sat on this bench for 15 years. I've heard every variation of "it was an emergency." Speeding endangers lives. The posted limits exist to protect our community, including children. The irony of his statement about protecting children wasn't lost on Sarah. Her phone buzzed again. Another message about the donor threatening to withdraw support for the children's wing. She noticed the judge's eyes narrow at her casual clothes, at her phone, at everything that didn't fit his preconception of what responsibility looked like. Court records show this is your second violation in 18 months. Judge Patterson continued, shuffling through papers. Your previous fine was clearly insufficient as a deterrent. Sarah's legal training screamed at her to point out that her last ticket had been dismissed with explanation, but experience had taught her when pushing back would only make things worse. She watched as the judge scribbled on his notepad, his demeanor dismissive. Given the repeat offense and your apparent lack of regard for both traffic laws and court decorum, he gestured at her attire. I'm setting the fine at $1,500, due within 30 days. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the court clerk looked up in surprise. Typical fines for similar violations rarely exceeded $500. Sarah's hand tightened around her phone, feeling the weight of the hospital board's messages growing heavier by the minute. Additionally, the judge added, I'm requiring attendance at a driver safety course to be completed within 60 days. Sarah's professional mask slipped for just a moment. Your Honor, this fine seems disproportionate to the. Would you like to make it $2,000, Ms. Jenkins? Judge Patterson's tone carried the finality of someone used to having the last word. This court's time is valuable. Pay the fine, take the course, and perhaps next time dress appropriately when you appear before this bench. As Sarah turned to leave, she caught sight of her reflection in the courtroom's window, the casual clothes that masked the board executive underneath. For a fleeting moment, she considered turning back, pulling out her credentials, name-dropping the governor who had appointed her to the hospital board. But she had fought this battle too many times before. Instead, she pulled out her phone as she walked briskly toward the exit, typing a message to the board. Delayed by urgent court matter. Starting presentation in 20 minutes. Tell Dr. Richardson to stall the donor. Behind her, Judge Patterson was already calling the next case, having dismissed her from his mind as quickly as he dismissed her attempts to explain. He'd seen thousands of defendants, categorized them, judged them, and moved on. It was efficient. It was routine. It was justice, or so he believed. Neither of them could have known that in less than a week they would meet again under very different circumstances. The judge's gavel would be replaced by a champagne glass, and Sarah's hoodie by an evening gown. But for now, they parted ways, each carrying their own versions of what had just transpired. One seeing defiance that needed correction, the other experiencing yet another instance of prejudgment that needed to be overcome. 3 days after the courtroom incident, the Grand Plaza Hotel's ballroom sparkled with the city's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables draped in ivory silk, each place setting worth more than Judge Patterson's weekly salary. He adjusted his bow tie, feeling somewhat out of place despite his position of authority. Michael, glad you could make it, called out Mayor Thompson, champagne flute in hand. The Children's Hospital Gala is the event of the season. We're expecting a major announcement tonight about the new pediatric wing. Patterson nodded, accepting a glass from a passing waiter. He'd attended these functions before. Necessary obligations for someone of his standing in the community. The usual faces surrounded him: politicians, business leaders, old money families who funded the city's major institutions. He knew how to navigate these waters, even if he never felt entirely comfortable in them. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats," announced the MC, his voice carrying across the murmuring crowd. "We have an extraordinary evening ahead." Judge Patterson found his assigned table near the front, noting with satisfaction that he'd been seated with other judicial colleagues and city officials. As the first course arrived, a delicate salmon tartare, he half-listened to the typical speeches about community service and charitable giving. And now, the MC's voice took on a note of excitement. "I'm honored to introduce our keynote speaker. Under her leadership, our children's hospital has secured unprecedented funding for groundbreaking programs. She's been featured in Forbes 40 Under 40, holds 3 advanced degrees including a Harvard Law degree, and serves on multiple national healthcare boards." Patterson lifted his fork, only halfway interested. "Another privileged executive, no doubt. Please welcome our Executive Board Director and Head of Pediatric Development Programs, Dr. Sarah Jenkins." The fork clattered against fine china as Patterson's hand froze mid-motion. Walking onto the stage was a woman in a stunning emerald evening gown, her natural hair now styled in elegant curves framing her face. Gone was the casual hoodie, replaced by the unmistakable presence of someone who commanded respect. Sarah approached the podium with measured steps, her pearl earrings catching the light. "Thank you, everyone. 3 days ago, I was reminded why our work at Children's Hospital is so vital." Her eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on Judge Patterson's table. "We live in a world of snap judgments and preconceptions, where appearance can override reality." The judge felt heat rising in his collar as she continued. "Today, I'm thrilled to announce that our new pediatric wing project has secured not just the planned $50 million in funding, but an additional $20 million from our anonymous donor." Applause erupted. "This wing will serve thousands of children from all backgrounds, regardless of how they look, dress, or where they come from." Patterson barely heard the rest of her speech. His mind raced back to the courtroom, seeing their interaction in a horrifying new light. He watched as she expertly worked the room after her speech, greeting the governor by his first name, discussing policy with the state health director, sharing a private joke with the mayor's wife. "Remarkable woman," commented Judge Harris, seated beside him. "Did you know she started a mobile clinic program that serves underprivileged neighborhoods? Saved the hospital millions in emergency room costs." "I wasn't aware," Patterson managed, taking a long sip of water. "Oh, and get this," Harris continued, oblivious to his colleague's discomfort. "She does surprise visits to these clinics regularly, often in casual clothes, so she can really understand the patient experience." Brilliant leadership strategy. Each word felt like another weight on Patterson's conscience. He watched as Sarah accepted congratulations from various dignitaries, her professional ease a stark contrast to the dismissive way he treated her in court. When she glanced in his direction again, her slight smile carried no malice, which somehow made it worse. The evening stretched endlessly before him, each moment a reminder of his grievous error in judgment. As he observed Sarah commanding the room with grace and authority, Judge Patterson realized that tomorrow's cases would find him a changed man. But first, he had some serious self-reflection to do, and perhaps an apology to plan. The evening's momentum belonged entirely to Sarah Jenkins. After her keynote speech, she moved through the gala with practiced elegance, each interaction reinforcing what Judge Patterson had missed in his courtroom. From his corner table, he couldn't help but watch her commanding performance. "Tell us about the inspiration behind the new pediatric wing design," asked Councilwoman Martinez, drawing Patterson's attention to the conversation nearby. Sarah had unrolled architectural plans on an empty table, surrounded by an eager audience of donors and city officials. "We've revolutionized the traditional hospital layout," Sarah explained, her finger tracing the blueprints. "See these circular pods? They're designed to create community spaces where families can support each other. Many of our patients' parents can't afford to take time off work, so we've incorporated remote working stations within each pod. The judge found himself drifting closer, drawn by her expertise and passion. The most innovative feature, she continued, is our integrated legal aid office. Many families facing medical crises also face legal challenges, housing issues, employment discrimination, custody concerns. Her eyes flickered briefly toward Judge Patterson. We believe in treating the whole family, not just the medical symptoms. Governor Richards appeared at Sarah's elbow. Dr. Jenkins, your vision for healthcare equity is exactly what this state needs. Would you consider joining our Healthcare Policy Advisory Board? Thank you, Governor. Sarah smiled warmly. I'd be honored, though my schedule is quite full with unexpected commitments lately. Another subtle glance at the judge. Perhaps we could discuss it over lunch next week. Patterson watched as she navigated these high-level interactions with seemingly effortless grace. Each conversation revealed another layer of her accomplishments, the scholarship foundation she'd established, her pioneering research in healthcare accessibility, her upcoming TED talk on medical equity. Dr. Jenkins called out the hospital's chief of surgery. Tell them about the mobile clinic success rates. Sarah's face lit up. In our first year, we reduced emergency room visits by 40% in underserved neighborhoods. But numbers only tell part of the story. She paused, her voice taking on a more personal tone. Last week, I visited one of our mobile units in casual clothes, something I do regularly to understand the patient experience firsthand. A young mother recognized me from a previous visit and broke down crying. Her daughter's asthma had been uncontrolled for years until our clinic provided proper medication and follow-up care. The irony of her words wasn't lost on anyone who knew about the courtroom incident. Several guests who'd heard about the traffic court scene through the city's gossip channels shot knowing looks at Judge Patterson. That's why appearance can be deceiving. Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly. Sometimes the person in casual clothes rushing to a meeting might be racing to save lives, not just avoiding a traffic ticket. The judge felt his face flush as nearby conversations hushed. Sarah, however, smoothly redirected attention back to the hospital plans, demonstrating the leadership quality that had earned her such respect. The true measure of our society, she addressed the group, is how we treat those who appear before us, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. Whether in a hospital, a boardroom, or a courtroom, everyone deserves to be heard. As the evening progressed, Judge Patterson observed Sarah receiving business cards from senators, exchanging contact information with international healthcare representatives, and accepting invitations to speak at prestigious conferences. Each interaction amplified the magnitude of his misjudgment. The final blow came when the mayor took the podium again. Before we conclude this evening, I have one more announcement. Dr. Jenkins has been nominated for the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her groundbreaking work in healthcare equity. The ballroom erupted in applause. Sarah accepted the recognition with characteristic grace, but her acceptance speech carried a message that pierced straight through Patterson's judicial armor. Thank you all. But this nomination belongs to every person who's ever been judged by their appearance rather than their actions. Success isn't about how we look or what we wear. It's about the lives we touch and the changes we create. As the applause thundered through the ballroom, Judge Patterson realized that in his courtroom, he had been the one on trial, and he had failed spectacularly. At 2:47 a.m., Judge Michael Patterson sat in his home office, the glow of his computer screen casting harsh shadows across his face. His usual evening routine, a glass of scotch and legal briefs, had been replaced by a relentless online search of Sarah Jenkins' accomplishments. The browser tabs told a story that made his $1,500 fine seem increasingly absurd. Harvard Law Review Editor, Healthcare Innovation Award, 30 Most Influential Women in Medicine. His cursor hovered over a video titled Dr. Sarah Jenkins, Revolutionizing Urban Healthcare. With a click, her voice filled his silent office. Growing up, I learned that appearance often predetermined treatment. Sarah's recorded voice explained to a captivated TED Talk audience. That's why our mobile clinics operate on a no-judgment policy. The single mother in workout clothes might be rushing between 3 jobs. The teenager in a hoodie might be caring for 6 siblings. Patterson minimized the video, unable to bear the parallels. His email inbox showed 30 unread messages, unusual for this hour. Word of the gala encounter had spread through the judicial community like wildfire. One email from Judge Martinez particularly stung. Heard you met Dr. Jenkins properly tonight. Quite different from traffic court, eh? He opened his case files from the past month, spreadsheets of fines and sentences sprawling before him. Patterns emerged that he'd never noticed, or perhaps had chosen not to notice. The highest fines, the strictest sentences, the least patience shown. There was a demographic trend he couldn't ignore. His daughter's framed law school graduation photo caught his eye. "Dad," she'd said at dinner last week, "we had a whole course on implicit bias in the justice system." He'd dismissed it then as academic theory. Now, her words haunted him. The clock ticked past 3 a.m. as he pulled up the courthouse security footage from Sarah's appearance. He watched himself through new eyes, saw the dismissive glances, the interrupted explanations, the assumptions made before she'd spoken a single word. The judge on screen wasn't dispensing justice. He was performing authority. His phone buzzed. A text from his wife. "Coming to bed. Can't sleep," he typed back. "Working on something important." Important was an understatement. This wasn't just about one wrongful fine or one misjudged person. This was about hundreds of cases, thousands of decisions, 15 years of potentially biased justice. He opened a new document and began typing. Proposed changes to courtroom procedure. 1. Mandatory pause before sentencing to review case facts independent of defendant's appearance. 2. Standardized fine structure with written justification for deviations. 3. Monthly review of sentencing patterns with demographic analysis. The list grew as dawn approached. Each point felt simultaneously insufficient and overwhelmingly necessary. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but sleep was impossible. The weight of his realizations demanded action. A new email notification popped up. The hospital's newsletter. The featured story showed Sarah in her casual clothes, sitting cross-legged on the floor of a mobile clinic, reading to sick children. The caption read, "Dr. Jenkins continues her tradition of unannounced visits, ensuring quality care at every level." Patterson leaned back in his chair, the first light of dawn creeping through his window. On his desk, a stack of business cards from the gala included contact information for bias training consultants, diversity experts, and judicial reform advocates. He collected them silently throughout the evening, each one a potential tool for change. His court schedule for the day ahead showed 20 cases, 20 opportunities to do better, or to perpetuate the same biases. The responsibility felt enormous. As he finally stood to prepare for the day ahead, his reflection in the window stopped him. The distinguished judge staring back seemed different somehow, humbled, perhaps, or simply awakened. Either way, he knew that walking into his courtroom today would require more than just his usual robe and gavel. It would require a new perspective, one that had kept him awake all night, but might help him truly stay awake to his own biases for years to come. Sarah's corner office at the Children's Hospital overlooked the construction site of the new pediatric wing. At 9 a.m., sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating walls adorned with medical journals featuring her research, humanitarian awards, and children's artwork from grateful patients. Judge Patterson stood in the doorway, his usual courtroom confidence notably absent. "Your assistant said you had a few minutes," he began, his voice carrying none of its previous judicial authority. "I appreciate you agreeing to see me." Sarah didn't look up from the architectural plans spread across her desk. 3 minutes, actually. We're finalizing the trauma center layout." She made a notation on the blueprint, her Harvard Law ring catching the light. "Though I suppose that's more time than you gave me in court." The judge shifted uncomfortably, clutching a folder he brought. "Dr. Jenkins, about that day." "Please," she interrupted, finally looking up. Save the carefully rehearsed apology. I've heard variations of it throughout my career. After board meetings where I was mistaken for the secretary. At hospitals where patients assumed I was the nurse, not the chief of surgery. In courtrooms where she let the sentence hang. Patterson stood straighter. You're right. A simple apology would be insufficient. That's why I brought this. He opened the folder, revealing statistical breakdowns of his courtroom decisions over the past 5 years. I spent the night analyzing my own bias. The patterns are disturbing. This caught Sarah's attention. She gestured to a chair, her expression softening slightly. Go on. Defendants of color received fines averaging 40% higher than white defendants for identical violations, he continued. My interruption rate shows similar disparities. I've been practicing what I thought was justice, but the data shows something else entirely. Sarah stood and walked to a wall of photographs. See these. She pointed to images of children in various medical settings. Each one represents a family that faced prejudgment before coming here. The boy in the hoodie. His single father works 3 jobs. The girl in worn clothes. Her mother saved for months for the treatment. Every snap judgment, every dismissive gesture, every assumption. They all have ripple effects. Which is why I'd like your help, Patterson said, pulling out another document. I'm proposing a comprehensive bias training program for our courthouse. But I don't want it to be just another bureaucratic checkbox. I want real change. Sarah turned, studying him with the same analytical gaze she used for complex medical cases. And you think one incident of realizing your bias qualifies you to lead this change? No, he replied firmly. I think it qualifies me to learn, to listen, to understand how deeply these biases run and how much damage they do. The gala was my wake-up call. But this, he gestured to his data. This is my education beginning. A small smile played at the corners of Sarah's mouth. She walked back to her desk and pressed the intercom. Janet, clear my 10 a.m. To Patterson, she said. Show me your proposal. For the next hour, they dissected his courthouse data. Sarah pointed out patterns he'd missed, suggested structural changes, and shared stories from her own experiences. The judge took notes frantically, his legal pad filling with insights and action items. Your fine structure needs complete reconstruction, Sarah noted, circling a section of his report. And these intervention points, they're reactive, not preventive. Patterson nodded, absorbing each criticism. Would you consider consulting on the program development? Sarah leaned back, considering. On one condition. She pulled up security footage from the courthouse on her computer, his dismissive behavior playing in high definition. We use this as the opening example. Raw, unedited, with both of us there to discuss it. The judge watched his recorded self with visible discomfort. Agreed, he said finally. Though it won't be easy. It's not supposed to be, Sarah replied, standing to signal the meeting's end. Real change never is. The question is, are you ready to feel as uncomfortable every day as you felt that night at the gala? As Patterson gathered his materials, Sarah added softly, the fine, by the way, was for speeding to an emergency board meeting about the pediatric wing. The one that just got fully funded. The irony wasn't lost on either of them as they stood looking out at the construction site, where change, both physical and metaphorical, was already underway. 2 weeks after their office meeting, Judge Patterson stood before a packed courthouse conference room. The usual portraits of stern-faced former judges had been temporarily replaced by statistics and graphs, visual evidence of systemic bias in their judicial system. Sarah Jenkins stood quietly at the back, observing. Before we begin today's training, Patterson addressed his fellow judges and courthouse staff, his voice carrying unusual vulnerability. I want to share a story about a $1,500 traffic fine. A ripple of recognition moved through the room. The story had become courthouse legend, though never before heard from its source. Sarah noticed several judges shifting uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recognizing their own potential for similar mistakes. But first, He continued, "We're going to watch some security footage. And I'd warn you, it's not easy to watch." He nodded to the technician, and the video began playing on the large screen. The footage showed his interaction with Sarah from multiple angles. Each dismissive gesture, each interruption, each assumption played out in stark clarity. Patterson stood beside the screen, forcing himself to watch along with his colleagues. "Now," he said as the video ended, "I'd like to introduce Dr. Sarah Jenkins, though many of you know her from the recent Children's Hospital Gala. She's agreed to help us understand the broader impact of what you just witnessed." Sarah walked to the front, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Thank you, Judge Patterson. That footage wasn't just about one interaction. It represents thousands of similar moments that happen in courtrooms, boardrooms, and hospitals every day." She pulled up a new slide, statistical breakdowns of judicial decisions across the state. These numbers tell a story, but behind each percentage point is a human being who walked into this courthouse expecting justice. For the next hour, Sarah and Patterson tag-teamed the presentation. They broke down the traffic court incident, parsing each moment where bias influenced decisions. Sarah shared similar experiences from her professional life, while Patterson revealed his own journey of recognition. The hardest part, Patterson admitted to the silent room, wasn't realizing I had made a mistake. It was understanding that it wasn't really a mistake at all. It was a pattern I couldn't see until it was put right in front of me. During the break, Judge Martinez approached Sarah. "I've been on the bench 20 years, she confessed. "Watching that footage, I saw myself in some of those moments." "That's exactly why we're here," Sarah responded, glancing at Patterson, who was deep in conversation with other judges. "Recognition is step one. Action is step two." The afternoon session focused on practical changes. Patterson presented his reformed fine structure, now based on objective criteria rather than subjective judgments. Sarah introduced a checklist system for judges to review their decisions for potential bias. But the most important change, Patterson emphasized, is creating a system of accountability. Dr. Jenkins has agreed to review our quarterly statistics and provide ongoing training. As the session wound down, Sarah noticed something remarkable. The initial defensive postures had given way to engaged discussion. Judges who had arrived skeptical were now sharing their own experiences with bias, asking questions about how to recognize their blind spots. "Your Honor," a young clerk asked Patterson, "will this affect our case processing time?" "It might," he acknowledged. "But ask yourself, would you rather have swift justice or fair justice?" Sarah stepped forward. "Why not both? Part of our ongoing work will be developing efficient systems that promote equity without sacrificing effectiveness." As the room cleared out, Patterson and Sarah stood looking at the statistical displays. "This is just the beginning," she said. "Real change takes time." "I know," he replied. "But today, watching my colleagues engage with this, it feels possible." Sarah smiled. It always was possible. Sometimes we just need a wake-up call, even if it comes in the form of a traffic ticket. They shared a knowing look, both aware that their unlikely partnership had become a catalyst for change. The courthouse would never be quite the same. And that was exactly the point. As they gathered their materials, Sarah's phone buzzed with a hospital emergency. Some things never changed. But as she rushed out, no one questioned her hurry. And that perhaps was change enough for one day. 6 months after the initial training session, Judge Patterson's courtroom had transformed in subtle but significant ways. The morning's docket proceeded differently than it once had, each case given careful consideration, each defendant afforded genuine respect. "Case number 103, speeding violation," his clerk announced. A young man in work clothes approached the bench, clearly nervous. Patterson noticed his colleague, Judge Martinez, sitting in the back row. She had begun a rotation where judges observed each other's courts, part of their new accountability measures. "Before we begin," Patterson said, warmth replacing his once stern demeanor, "please tell me your name and circumstances." The changes went beyond individual cases. New signs in multiple languages welcomed courthouse visitors. A feedback box invited comments about court experiences. Statistical charts tracking judicial decisions hung in the judges' chambers, a constant reminder of their commitment to equity. During the lunch break, Sarah Jenkins arrived for their monthly review meeting. She now had a dedicated parking space, marked Bias Training Consultant, right next to the judge's reserved area. "Your numbers are improving," she noted, spreading out their latest analysis. "Fine disparities have dropped 60% since we started." Patterson nodded, but his expression remained serious. "Yet we still see gaps in certain areas. The morning traffic court especially. Progress isn't perfection," Sarah reminded him. "But speaking of traffic court," she slid a document across the table. "The state Supreme Court wants us to present our program. They're considering implementing it statewide." The news represented everything they'd hoped for, systematic change reaching beyond their courthouse walls. Yet Patterson's response surprised her. "Before we do that," he said, "I'd like to try something." He pulled out his own document. "I've been tracking cases similar to yours. Professionals rushing to emergencies. We found 23 instances in the past year where we find people without fully understanding their situations." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "And I'd like to review them. All of them. And where appropriate, issue refunds along with formal apologies." "That's not technically necessary under any regulation," Sarah pointed out. "No," Patterson agreed, "but it's right. Real change isn't just about moving forward. Sometimes it's about correcting past mistakes." Later that afternoon, Patterson stood before a gathered crowd in the courthouse's main hall. Journalists lined the back wall. The story of their bias training program had caught national attention. "6 months ago," he began, "a traffic ticket taught me more about justice than 15 years on the bench. Today, we're announcing 2 initiatives. First, our bias training program will be recommended for statewide implementation." Applause filled the hall. Sarah, standing beside the mayor, smiled quietly. "Second," Patterson continued, "we're launching a retroactive review program, because true justice must look backward as well as forward." As he outlined the details, he noticed a familiar face entering the hall. The young woman wore a hoodie and sneakers, but this time, no one made assumptions. Dr. Sarah Jenkins had taught them all too well for that. After the presentation, Sarah approached him. "Quite a difference from that morning in traffic court." "The difference isn't just in the courthouse," Patterson replied. "It's in us." He gestured to where judges and staff mingled with community members, barriers breaking down through simple conversation. A law student raised her hand during the Q&A session. "What inspired this program?" Patterson looked at Sarah, who nodded slightly. "A seemingly routine traffic stop," he answered honestly, "and a very expensive lesson in checking my assumptions." "The fine was $1,500, Sarah added, drawing laughs from those who knew the story. "Best money I never got," Patterson responded, earning more chuckles. "Because it bought something priceless, a wake-up call that changed not just me, but an entire system." As the crowd dispersed, Sarah checked her phone. Another hospital emergency requiring her attention. But this time, as she rushed out of the courthouse, she moved through a different environment than she had 6 months ago. The security guards smiled in recognition. The clerks waved her through. And in his chambers, Judge Patterson added another document to a growing file labeled "Changes to Make." Because they both knew that real transformation wasn't a destination but a journey, one that had started with a traffic ticket but would continue long after the headlines faded.